My name is Cate Consandine. I'm an artist living and working in Melbourne, and I'm an academic lecturer at the University of Melbourne. And I'm here to talk about my work Ringer, which is currently exhibited at the Buxton Museum. So Ringer is a filmic work with a sound composition by Françoise Tetaz. It's a filmic work that is presented across 3 curved screens in the gallery, and each of those screens sit at the periphery of a 9 diameter. Each of those screens sit at the periphery of a circle, and so it presents a moving image work within a very particular screen architecture, which is what's unique about Ringer. The architecture itself is kind of designed to allow the viewer to enter the work and experience the work from the inside. And it's scaled and situated to really fit the spaces of the Buxton Museum in a very, very particular way. The sound composition similarly sort of meets that circular logic in that there's a 9-speaker surround sound that's coming into play with the visual language through the moving image and cinematic placement of the work. Yeah. So Ringer was filmed in the Martin Meyer Arena at the VCA, and that is a big black box theatre. And when I was conceiving the work, I was thinking about the logic of how it was filmed and really wanting to sort of explore the moving image through a sculptural language and logic. And that for me is always circular. So where I sort of start and my entry point to practice is through sculpture to moving image medium. And I always think about the way that sculpture sits and is orientated both within a space and also how we make sculpture. So in forming a sculptural work, I will move around it to make it because it's something that exists in 3 dimension. And in moving around the work, I sort of think about that as a kind of first choreography. It's the artist's movement in relationship to sculpture. So in trying to understand a logic for the work within the Martin Meyer Arena, we set up a circular track, which is a kind of unique tracking system and a way of filming, again, in the round. So it kind of meets a similar language and a similar logic through sculpture. And we set up 2 Aria mirror cameras, which are cinema cameras, on 2 dollies, and we move them around that circular tracking system. And that became a kind of, again, a sort of circuit of a logic that sat at the foundation of the way the work was filmed. What it is really is an action film sequence with some sort of really quite beautiful formal abstractions that sit within the work. So I wanted to create an action film sequence, but I wanted it to have a similar embodiment and sensual and tensile kind of register that I understand through my body in relationship to sculpture. So the way I wanted to direct it and explore the work was directing through the body, and I wanted to work with other bodies. And it just happened that an action film sequence was the form that I wanted to utilise to explore that, to explore a choreographic language of bodies moving in space, directed through a kind of position of my embodiment to try to understand how that could be captured and how that could be captured differently. So I worked with 6 World Championship roller derby players that are located in Melbourne. And I sort of thought about roller derby really as a form to explore a whole range of things about bodies in space, but also the kind of state of tension and combat that might be explored between female players within the arena of roller derby, and how that might be brought to the arena both through a filmic process and the arena of the work that I've set up in the gallery, both architecturally and spatially, and through the way that I'm thinking about moving image. Those roller derby players are circling the track and we're filming them. So what I was trying to capture at the essence of the work was that peripheral space of movement. And also other filmic gestures as well to capture sort of aspects of slow cinema or slow movement, capturing female players together in a state of combat. So a whole lot of sort of temporal conditions were explored in the work, different states of speed and slowness, different explorations of contact between bodies. And, you know, I guess I was bringing all of that logic sort of back into the architectural scheme of the work to try to position it within the presentation, within Buxton. So fundamentally the work comes through the body as a kind of first material for practice, and through a relationship to a sculptural logic that meets moving image. And it extends and opens out, you know, from that space, I think. What was really, really interesting to me in this process was trying to reach into or grasp at a way of understanding an action sequence that could move away from, I guess, a male or more patriarchal gaze and embrace an embodied gaze. When the viewer enters the work, they can't capture everything at once because they're in the centre of a 3 circular screen structure. And I think that's kind of really interesting because it shifts away from cinematic action sequences that we might be more familiar with, say with films like Tarantino or Michael Mann, or neo-noir action film sequences that fix the gaze on a subject. You can't fix on these subjects, so they're continually shifting and moving away from you. You can't objectify them, yet you feel the presencing of the energy of the bodies of the players and the physicality and the space of combat and tension and violence and sensuality between them in a very, very different way. So there are a number of sequences that sort of sit within the work, and I consider them all different choreographies. Different choreographies of movement. So 3 acts, maybe 3 choreographies. And the work kind of opens with a scene which presents the floor of the Martin Meyer Arena, sort of captured as its own landscape, with all of the scratches and the cuts into the floor, which is a residue or a trace of that action sequence filmed after the event. So there's a sense of something evacuated already or emptied out, but what we're left with is that kind of mark of action sequencing. And that introduction is kind of presented almost as its own floating landscape that could sit in this space, but it could also sit in outer space. It has a strange science fiction to it. The work then moves through this kind of landscape of cinematic blue, which starts to tease in after the first sequence. And it's not a blue screen, which is a digital blue space that we're quite familiar with. It is a cinematic, shifting blue sequence of light. And it moves around all of those 3 screens very, very slowly and envelops the viewer. And so when the viewer walks in, they're sort of touched with this blue cinematic light that vibrates and pulses. And I guess there's all kinds of reference points that I could speak to in terms of the way that blue is used in filmic language. But certainly any kind of colour field brings its own emotional and psychological experience to the viewer. and holds the viewer in a very strange space. I mean, we've talked about it before in the sense of my understanding of this whole work as being like a large blue eye. So when I'm thinking about the gaze, it situates itself as a kind of eye. And that eye moves through states of interiority and expansion, transience and compression. It holds the viewer in that blue space. But there's also a sense of a kind of an internalization that occurs when the viewers, or through the encounter, one is trying to understand where they are and what is this strange light field. It has beautiful references to painting with colour. I think also it has sculptural references to artists like James Turrell, who are sort of creating these kind of blue zones that have a sense of depth or expansion to them. But I see the blue as a kind of situated in a kind of twilight. It's in between day and night. It's indeterminate. And I think there's a pressing through of that blue to the viewer, a kind of emotional and psychological feeling, or a kind of sensation that comes with colour. Into that blue sequence, we start to feel these peripheral movements of bodies that are passing across all three screens in different moments, that to create a kind of action sequence within the blue. So it emerges through this colour field. And there's a sort of glassiness to the way the figures appear. We're not quite sure if we saw them or not. They're moving at real time, but in the scope of this work, or the experience of this work, it's really hard to catch them. And we think, did I see something or did I not see something? What's happening? And there's a sense maybe of being encircled, or of kind of hallucinatory or haunting figures moving past you in real time. But the temporal sense of it is very, very strange. It's a very strange experience. And I've been trying to think about what that is. It creates its own energy and its own sense of a kind of haunting anticipation for what's to come next in the work. I think as we're transitioning into the last act, we're moving away from that peripheral sense of the gaze, of partial figures passing, in these kind of strange spaces in front and behind and around the body. And it sort of drops into black. And in that black, there's again bodies, a central figure or a central player in the work comes in to the field of our vision. And again, it's in real time, and just starts to alert us to a transition between a kind of abstraction of blue and a kind of an abstraction of haunting in the work, into something that then all of a sudden feels quite real and embodied in a very, very different way. So as that little interstitial moment transitions, there is a central player that sort of comes into a kind of almost Terminator move, which is my most action-y moment, I think, in the work. And her name is Sarah Love, and she's a kind of central player. And she sort of swoops into the side of the screen and then moves into the pack of players. And all of a sudden we can now see the players together. And there is a durational sequence within the work that holds across all three screens. I think it lasts for about 5 minutes of a slow motion, slow film, slow cinematic sequence that explores this kind of very deep pack contact and combat space between the players in that moment. And it's quite tense, it's violent, it has an intensity of its energy, It's also, because it's filmed in slow motion and it's held for such a long period of time, there are sensual aspects to it that are surprising. And I think this is one of the aspects of the work that I'm reflecting upon a lot at the moment, is that relationship between violence or tension and the sensuality that's so palpable in this work. And I've been sort of grappling with that in my own way and thinking, well, actually, I think this brings it back to a female embodiment and a female gaze. And it allows the kind of violent gestures or moments to be held somehow. And to be held over a period of time, I think, allows the viewer to travel with it, to sit with it, to go through a range of different feelings and emotions, and to understand what's happening between female players in this combat sequence or action sequence through a number of different kinds of registers. And that, for me, is the kind of beauty of a slow cinematic moment. And I could speak about different filmmakers. I always go back to Tarkovsky and the way Andrei Tarkovsky uses slow cinema and talks about slow cinema in terms of the way we sculpt in time. And that when we sort of allow for a slow capture and a durational moment to occur in a filmic work, he would sort of talk about it in terms of the way a kind of emotional space presses right through the screen and is captured or embraced by the viewer or felt by the viewer in a very, very particular way. And it speaks to the very materiality of the filmic medium itself, but it also allows for more internal as well as external gazing kind of experiences where we're looking but we're also internalizing and contemplating. So it's a very particular relationship to the experience of film when you're sort of holding something for a long duration. Yeah, it's unusual. It's unusual to sort of place a viewer right in the middle of a work like this. And to ask them to explore something where they can't see everything at once. But I feel like that allows for an experience of complex dimensionality through the viewing experience and through the gaze, which I think that women hold. We hold a very complex dimensionality in the way that we understand the world and the way we experience it, and through our gaze. And so that's something that's kind of was really, really interesting and important for me to explore. I had an instinct for roller derby, and an instinct's always based upon experience, right? So, I used to roller skate in the 80s, the 70s probably, 70s and early 80s. And I grew up on the streets in the sense that we were always out on the street on wheels of some form. And so I think that connection to movement on wheels, in the rink as well, which is its own arena, it has its own arena logic, was something that I connected to through my own body and the experience of my own body, probably in kind of early teens, late childhood, early teens. But there was something else that particularly sat within roller derby as a game that I was really interested in, and it was the intense combative space between female players that was explored and can be experienced within the arena of roller derby. And in a way, any game has its own rules and I think its own space of consent. And what I find interesting about roller derby is that it is women and female players are really attracted into the sport, and there's something that they want to explore physically in the space of combat. Where there are very, very few spaces where I think women can explore those dimensions within themselves. So there's a violence in a way that's played out between women in that game. It's consensual, but it's intense as well. It's really, really intense. And I was interested in that. I was interested in what is that, and what is it about I guess, what questions sit within the kind of arenas that we inhabit as women, and what's at stake for women, I guess. More what's at stake for women in the arenas that we inhabit, and how do these different conditions of violence and combat play out. I've spoken earlier about the kind of sensual aspects of that, the kind of hold, the pleasure and the pressure of those conditions. But I see it as a kind of way to speak about not just the game of roller derby, but the way that states of violence and combat are situated in a range of different arenas, which could be roller derby, it could be institutional, corporate, familial. You know, there are a lot of spaces where women experience different conditions of violence, but to explore that in the way that's played out between women, between female players, I felt was something really interesting and not often explored in artistic practice, but something I wanted to kind of examine, I guess, in a way through the work. Yeah. I shot this work over 3 days. I was really sensitive to the fact that the roller derby players are not performers. You know, they're in the world, they all have different jobs, and what I wanted to really explore was the physical relationship between them. And in a way, trying to move over a series of consecutive days, we filmed over 3 days, to move them to a place where they were no longer conscious of their body and the fact that they were being filmed, but rather pushing to a kind of edge condition or a limit, a physical limit that allowed them to just be in this moment of combat with one another. We shot over 3 days. The way that I directed this work and directed the players and the player performers within the work was to move them through a series of shots and start to build confidence through the filmic process so that they could sort of move outside of their bodies and be unaware of the camera, and to really just be able to hold a space of physical embodiment with one another. And I think in order to capture that final sequence in the work, we had to build over a number of days and build that confidence and that trust, and also to understand their body's relationship to the camera, so that the camera's there, they're no longer conscious of it, but they're conscious of it enough to know not to hit it because we're shooting really close, and to start to build a sense of urgency or intensity and trust over a number of days. The final sequence in this work was actually the last shot that we took, and it was about 11 o'clock at night on the 3rd day. We're about to be kicked out of the Martin Meyer Arena, and we just held for 20 more minutes to take that shot in slow motion, and so it's filmed in handheld and it's right in the thick of the action. So there's something very immediate and very gestural about the way the camera's movement and its, I guess, kind of relationship to the movement of the players and the bodies in relationship to the camera. So it's this kind of, you can kind of almost feel it, this flow, this push and pull, and the kind of embodiment of the camera in that moment is really palpable. And wanting to get those players into a state of, I guess, just complete combat with one another, and the ability to trust each other enough in a way to sort of really go into a space of attack. It's painful and it really hurts, and they were really exhausted in that moment. So it was something kind of, I guess, you're trying to put something at stake for the performers and capture that while still creating a kind of safe space for it. And you can only do that over a period of time, yeah, and with trust, yeah. I think the type of people that are attracted to roller derby, they sort of come into the game. It's a very social space, and it's often the type of games that I went to visit when I was sort of doing research for this project were happening in the suburbs. And, roller derby players aren't generally artists or art, they don't connect with an art audience. They're not, roller derby players are not necessarily sort of into the arts and they're not dancers. They're sort of exploring this game from a very, very different perspective. And there's a theatre to the game as well. I mean, the theatre that I've drawn out in this work, I'd say, is situated more in a kind of neo-noir zone. It really shifts away from the type of theatre that's actualised within the game of roller derby, in the suburban sort of context. But players really do have alter egos, and there's something about the game that's also performative. I guess what I love about working with these players is that they are physically unbelievably strong. And they have a skill in the body and a sense of their bodies, in movement, and in their physicality. That's very, very different to dance or other performative mediums and spaces. They're performing, they have alter egos and they're performing in the game, but, they're not connected to the art world. More often than not, they're not connected to the art world. So, they're living kind of real lives. And so to bring these players into a sort of art work in this way is to sort of connect into something that's sort of part of the culture of roller derby, but also to draw something out of that and bring it into the art world. And we've had quite a few of the players come and visit the work, and actually a number of people from the Victorian Roller Derby League come and see the work. And it's been kind of really curious to understand their responses to it as well. It shifts out of their expectation of the game that they're participating in, but also they deeply understand what I'm tapping into as well, because they feel it every time they're in the arena, and that they're in the game themselves. That kind of combat, it's something they're deeply, deeply drawn to. I don't want to make assumptions, but I feel there's something that they're deeply drawn to that allows them to explore their physicality in a very particular way. There are not very many spaces for that. It's kind of interesting to think about what happens in the sort of theatrical space of roller derby itself as a game, and then how that's reshaped and reimagined within the arena of this work. Yeah. I spoke earlier about the way that it was conceived through this circular screen logic. What I discovered when I brought the sort of edited file to the work within the context of the installation process is that actually what I was doing again was sculpting. And I was sculpting with light because there's a particular materiality to these screens. They're fabric. It's projected onto a deep grey. Everything needed to be projection mapped to fit perfectly to those screens. But in essence, what I discovered, which I knew it needed to be shaped, but it really surprised me how much the work needed to be shaped within the context of the installation process. And what I was really shaping was light in a space to a very particular sculptural materiality, which is the screen architecture of the work. And so we really had to spend quite a lot of days colour grading to sort of really understand how that initial file, that initial edit, would meet the context of the screen architecture onto which we were projecting and working with and shaping. And so a number of decisions about shifting the language of that occurred right in the moment of installation. And what I would say is I was held in a very safe space with the Buxton Museum that gave me the time. And I guess that kind of sensitivity to understand that this is not a point and shoot kind of situation. This is actually sculpting with moving image. So in response to when is a work finished, I probably would have stayed here for another month if anyone was prepared to let me, because I would probably keep going in and in and in, because what I was discovering so much about setting up a proposition like this, you feel it and you know it, you think you know it, but then you realise you've got to lean in and in and in and in and in, and that there are so many things to discover through that process. So the work is finished here in the Buxton Museum. This is where we landed, and I think, like for many artists, sometimes that's a time. It's a moment in time where you go, okay, this is the moment, this is the time, this is where the work sits. And I think it's such an extraordinary work. I am still discovering so many things about it. But I think it's an interesting question, but I can't give a clear answer, because I think for each different work, there's a different response. And sometimes when something is even re-exhibited in a different context, you realise that there's a different orientation or a different adjustment that could be made for each site and situated placement of the work. So, yes, I feel like this work has come to this beautiful moment here at the Buxton Museum, but I'm also now so curious and interested in what the shape of this work can offer, both, in its future iterations as well. And I'm reflecting upon that at the moment and thinking about what would this be if it was presented on monitors, or what would this look like if it was presented in a range of different forms. And every time you bring a work to a different site or architecture or presentation mode, you shift it again to adjust to that mode so that the form of the work perfectly meets the way that it's presented.